All right. I am super excited to kick off our second panel today. This panel is entitled ETOD Movement, Local and National Sponsors, Pioneers, and Best Practices. And our moderator for this panel is Mike Davidson, who is a supporter of Elevated Chicago as a steering committee member and the Senior Director of Community Impact at the Chicago Community Trust. And I will pass it off to Mike.
Thank you, Sandra. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Really good to be here. Michael Davidson, Senior Director with the Chicago Community Trust, where I lead the Catalyzing Neighborhood Investment Strategy. And I mean, nothing says neighborhood investment more than transit. I'm also a founding member of Elevated Chicago, and as Chandra said, I represent the Trust on Elevated's Steering Committee and Operations Committee. And so today we're going to talk about ETOD as a kind of national movement with some folks who know something about this topic, who know something about real estate, and ETOD and real estate go hand in hand. We've got some that are creating the conditions for ETOD to happen, like Sandra, Nina, and we've got someone who's actually living it, an entrepreneur who's doing development, just like Phil in the previous session. But before we do that, I did want to provide a little bit of background. We heard some of it from Commissioner Novara. It's a great, harrowing story about the creation of Elevated Chicago. Now, we're talking years ago. A small group of people sat in a room 7 or 8 years ago, talking about how this city and region have a kind of built-in blueprint for sustainable, equitable growth, our transit system. Something like, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, about 400 stations, transit stations throughout the region. About 150 of those are in the CTA system. So while other regions around the world were spending literally tens of billions of dollars trying to retrofit their sprawling urban landscapes to accommodate a transit system, we already had one. And Nina, I'm thinking of Los Angeles, where you come from, which is spending tens of billions of dollars to retrofit sprawling LA Metro to accommodate mass transit. So we already had one in this region. And that we weren't optimizing it seemed, I don't know, to me sort of blasphemous. It seemed ashamed. It just seemed wasteful. And as was also noted in that room that day, there wasn't a concerted, organized, sustained coalition effort underway to do anything about it. Nothing focused exclusively on TOD, let alone ETOD, in a city and region with this enviable legacy transit system. And I've just always wondered if that was largely because people were disconnected from the system, particularly in the parts of the region with sustained disinvestment. You know, when your, quite frankly, unpleasant transit station is surrounded by unpleasant land uses, we've heard a lot of talk already about vacant land, why on earth would something like TOD speak to you? You know, how would you even know what you're missing? And yet, I think we knew, those of us in the room that day, that public transportation was a pathway, a well-researched pathway to both racial equity and economic mobility. It was something CNT, and I don't think Jackie is here anymore. She was here earlier, Jackie Grimshaw. It was something that CNT had studied for years, the connection between economic mobility and quality public transportation. So Elevated Chicago was born out of that conversation, and a very talented team of, I'm calling them uniters, Roberto, you and the team, was hired to staff this thing we called Elevated Chicago, which they've done beautifully. Yes, thank you. Yes, they deserve your applause. They really do. They work really hard. And those of us on the steering committee, Leslie, Chandra, you know this, we get a lot of the credit. It is Roberto, Marley, Janice, the staff. It is a small lean. They work really hard. So within a couple of years, there was enough buy-in after the creation of Elevated Chicago. And I make this sound like it was easy, but it took a couple of years, a lot of meetings, a lot of socialization, but eventually there was enough buy-in from the communities that became involved in the Elevated Chicago Coalition to get the Emanuel administration, and I think Commissioner Navarro mentioned this, to get the Emanuel administration to shepherd the city's first ETOD policy plan through City Council. Really, really important. I think it might have been the last things that happened before that administration came to an end. And then to the credit of the Lightfoot administration and the many talented people who work there, they picked it up, which then led to codifying the policies in that plan, which became the Connected Communities Ordinance, arguably, probably the best such ordinance in the country. And if that weren't great enough, we've now got government capital to build in accordance with the new zoning ordinance. So there's money behind this thing to actually do, Sandra, brick and mortar, to do real estate development and other kinds of things, build things next to transit stations. But I think personally, the biggest win of all is the growing understanding and interest among the general population and the media of ETOD not only as a thing, but as a good thing, to be used as a tool for not just building a modern American city, but as a tool for equity, which I think modern American city and racial equity, they are going to be one and the same. If they are not already one and the same, they are going to be one and the same. And I credit the vast and then hugely diverse multi-sector Elevated Chicago network for that, and that's all of you. So, full transparency, we had a bit of a change in our panel discussion. This is cold and flu season. We're pushing December here now. We had two national speakers, one from Atlanta, one locally here with a Midwest service area. And our two national speakers are ill. And so we had to pinch hit literally an hour ago, Roberto and team. And we have two of our existing speakers. They are still with us, Laurie and Nina, and they're going to introduce themselves in a minute. But I want to give special credit to Sandra Ford, who is filling in, and she's going to do it beautifully because this person knows a lot about real estate finance. And so before we have them introduce themselves, because I was going to kind of read bios, I can't do that anymore because two of our original speakers are no longer here. I'm going to have them introduce themselves, just name, organization, a little bit what you do in your job, and then we're going to start the conversation. So, Sandra, let's start with you.
How about now?
There we go.
So I can be anyone I want to up here. I mean, it's just a very freeing kind of thing. But I will choose to be myself. And my name is Sandra Ford. And I am currently an employee of a CDFI called Low Income Investment Fund, headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in New Jersey. But I lived in Chicago for 13 years. 20 years ago. So, I don't know, I think once you live in Chicago, you're always a Chicagoan. There's something about it that pulls you back. And I'll say, I got here yesterday, and I feel like there was a test about the cold to see if I could still handle it, and I am proud to say that I can. So, I'm very glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Hey, one quick thing, Sandra. Tell the audience a little bit about what you do.
Okay. What I left out is that I'm part of the national team on the SPARCC initiative, Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, which is why I am so connected with Elevated Chicago, one of our 6 geographic tables. And my role there has been for the last 4 years to find ways to help provide support for the 6 geographies. A lot of it is money, you can't do anything without capital for sure. So there's money to do capital projects and to do policy things and health things. But there's also technical assistance and listening and learning and sharing and allowing opportunity for the six geographies to have the opportunity to talk to each other even when COVID exists. So it's been a joy for me. It's changed my life, honestly, the past 4 years in working with these organizations and being able to talk about race and equity and inclusion. And it's been an incredibly wonderful and freeing opportunity for me, and I'm grateful to Elevated Chicago for all that they have done to make this an amazing opportunity.
Thank you. Okay. Laurie, tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Laurie Ouding. I am actually a pediatric nurse at Rush, also a master urban farmer, and now a developer in the ETOD pilot project for the city. I've been working with Elevated Chicago for a few years. I was lucky enough to be in the first Equitable Ambassador Development program, the first cohort. Learned a lot, met some great people, and just really in sync with what Elevated Chicago is doing. As a nurse, I get to see, unfortunately, a lot of the inequities related to health and food and housing every day in the patients that I take care of. And that was really what inspired me to come up with this development that addresses food inequity and well-paying jobs and housing and all of the things really that contribute to health equity.
Thank you, Laurie. Nina.
Yes, I am here. My name is Nina Idemudia. Nice to see everybody. I am a planner by training, whether I like it or not. I really like it.
She likes it.
I do.
She's good at it.
I am. I'm originally from Detroit. It doesn't take you long to hear that from me. Thank you. Okay, lone Detroiter in the back of the room there. Michigan, there you go. Okay. And I will say,
I like Detroit.
I can't do the cold. Oh, yeah. Commissioner, yes, there we go. Go blue. And University of Michigan, I went to University of Michigan. And then, okay, see, the synergy here, the synergy. And then I moved to Los Angeles, lived in Los Angeles for 7 years, went to University of Southern California to get my planning degree, and stayed out there to work for the city of Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, I actually worked on transit neighborhood plans. So as was mentioned, there are lots of cities trying to get to where Chicago already is. And so basically our metro organization pays the planning department to actually upzone places around transit, and I was on that team. I've written ordinances that have affected millions of people. I have been displaced by my own policies. That's a whole nother story. And then I decided 3 years ago to move to Chicago because I was like, Chicago is closer to home, but not quite home. And I've been lucky enough to work for the city of Chicago in various roles, but currently I'm the Chicago Recovery Plan Director for the planning department. I oversee the equitable distribution of $237 million to help with the Chicago recovery, and I could not be prouder and more excited to do this work for the city because Chicagoans deserve it.
You bet. Okay, thank you. This is going to be a great conversation. So I'm going to start with something that's almost cliche, but I think some cliches they're cliches for a reason. This is an important question. I want to talk about the E in ETOD, and I want you to tell the audience what the E means to you in equitable transit-oriented development and why this should be important to cities. Why don't we start with you, Nina?
Yeah, for me, I think the E means one thing, but I see it being executed in lots of different ways. So like on paper, my team, especially when I became the director of this program and built this with my bare hands and, tried to figure out, okay, how do I want my team to think about equity and being equitable and the redistribution of resources, right? To make sure that, our resources are being distributed to the communities that need it most, but also with a lens on those that have been historically disadvantaged and completely left out of the system. And And so my team and I have a list of 5 values, actually, that we always go back to whenever we're making any decision. I think it's really easy for people and politicians and commissioners and the lay audience to say, like, yeah, equity, like, that's a thing, right? We should all be doing it. But then actually getting it in action can be very frustrating, especially working in the office that I work in, or working in city government, which I have plagued myself with working in city government, but I love it because there needs to be people like me at the table making decisions. Yes. Join city government, yes. So what equity looks like is not just saying the word 1,000 times or putting it in an announcement or, saying it in an article. It looks like, who are you hiring? Who's on your leadership staff? Who's making decisions? Who can veto those decisions? Where are you actually placing your money? Do you have data to back up where you're placing your money? Are you being transparent about where you're putting your money? If you make a mistake, are you being honest about it, or are you hiding it? There's lots of ways that you can actually embed equity into your processes and procedures and everything that we're talking about. But I think it has to be something tangible that you can see, that you can look at, that you can evaluate, and you can course correct. And it can't just be a word that we use without any meaning or oomph behind it.
Got it. How about you, Laurie? You don't have, it's your answer. It's not Nina's
right.
answer.
So I totally agree with what Nina's saying. I tend to think of equity as, again, it's one of those words that everybody can provide a definition for, but what does that mean to individuals? What does that mean to really every aspect of our lives, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about food access, whether we're talking about living wages. There's an equity lens that we need to really be putting on everything in our lives, everything that we think about. When we're shopping, where are we spending our money? Are we buying locally? Are we, thinking about those things on a daily basis? And what does that mean? And yes, definitely. What does it look like, equity? When we talk about ETOD and equity from a development lens, if you look at the developers across the city of Chicago, there's not a lot of developers that look like me or that look like Nina. It's, mostly male-driven entity. So equity across development also needs to be considered, for sure. But equity definitely is a lens that we need to look at through all of aspects of our lives. But the transit-oriented development, where that is considered, it affects the housing. It affects, the access. It affects our ability to be able to get a job in a different location. So the equity in ETOD is a lot of things, not just a definition.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, Sandra, you're a lender. You provide capital. So, curious about your understanding of equitable transit-oriented development from the perspective of capital provider. Because capital, now you work for a CDFI, so that there's a mission there, but a lot of capital doesn't go to the communities that we work in. So curious about your response to the question.
Thank you. So there are a couple things. I think your stories are personal, and equity has to have a personal, you have to have a personal view of it. I mean, it's got to be important to you. And so before I talk about the capital part of it, I'd like to talk about how I see equity. And for me, I think I see equity most when it's not there. When I moved to Chicago decades ago, I lived on the north side. And what I wanted to do was live someplace where I didn't have to use my car. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have to use my car on the north side. I had at least 4 express buses that I had the opportunity to take. And it was the lack of equity, as I look back on it, could not have been clearer. Not just in the opportunity that I had to get into the loop, but also the people that were on the bus with me. The segregation in Chicago could not have been clearer as someone who was a new resident of Chicago that I saw every single day. And so for me, in trying to find ways to create equity in my job, first started with my own personal experience. and working for a CDFI who's a community development financial institution that was created to find ways for banks to provide funding in low and moderate income neighborhoods where they didn't have the ability to make loans.
Ability in quotes.
Right. So
different panel discussion.
yes. So what's incredibly important to note is that these CDFIs have been around for decades, and the work that they have been done has been important. I don't want to suggest that it hasn't, but it hasn't so much been equitable. It's been opportunistic. Where can you find the money? Mm-hmm. What will the money allow you to do? And we'll do those things. And so I would say that one of the things that SPARCC has done, has moved, at least in the CDFI that I work with, is the idea that you have to talk about equity. You have to talk about race, and you have to talk about in data how you're going to make the changes that will allow equitable transit-oriented development and grocery stores in neighborhoods where there aren't any, and health opportunities. And so I would say that there has to be a movement. Part of that movement has to come from organizations that have capital opportunity, and there's a long, long way to go. But I just feel right now that there is a movement, an opportunity, an interest in finding ways to make sure there's capital in order to do the things that need to be done to make to provide equitable opportunities. And I think that CDFIs will hopefully, and they need to, be part of the leadership in that. But as I said, we've got a long way to go. We're just really kind of beginning, I think.
And we were fortunate at Elevated Chicago to have a couple CDFIs as founding members of our coalitions, and so CDFIs are at our table, and it has really made a difference. So let's have a short conversation about what I'm calling innovation. And each of you is doing something important to make sure development near transit is possible anywhere there's a transit station, not just in well-resourced places. And I want to start hyper-locally. So that's with you, Laurie. You're a nurse who's also now an entrepreneur, probably one of the few, maybe. And as if nursing isn't heavy enough as a lift. How you find time to do this, I don't know. But you've got this cool new real estate project, one of the first grants that we made a pre-development fund grant to your project. It was one of the first that we made. The real estate project is called Food Matters. You've talked a little bit about it. It's underway in Bronzeville near the 43rd Street Green Line station. So you and Phil must be friends. Neighbors. Yep, you're neighbors. First, maybe tell us a little bit about the project, and this is the interesting part, how a nurse practitioner becomes an entrepreneur and a developer. And then perhaps more germane to today's discussion, and I hope that you're going to love this as a nurse, how are the social determinants of health shaping this project? And why is being near a transit station a determinant? So again, a little bit about the project and how a nurse becomes a real estate developer, and then the project itself and how the social determinants of health are shaping it, and why being near a transit station factors into that.
So let me just give you a little bit of background. I moved here to the city of Chicago in 2008 from Southwest Michigan. The city that I lived in, Kalamazoo, we had this great food scene, very urban agriculture. I had family in the agriculture business, lived on 40 acres with a farm. I moved to North Lawndale, and it was like shocking to me that there was no grocery store. By the way, there still is no grocery store in North Lawndale this many years later, right? But then I also went from as a nurse working in a community hospital to working at Rush, which is a inner city hospital. And the patients that I see were completely different. The kids that I take care of here in the city of Chicago have many, many more nutrition problems than the kids that I took care of in Michigan. And it was heartbreaking for me to realize that a lot of the problems that these kids are having is based on just the food access, not only the food access, but the quality of the food. So sure, you might have a corner store, but what kind of food are you eating at that corner store? The affordability, lack of access. So taking care of those patients every single day and seeing all the social determinants of health, which we look at, when we're sending patients home, where are we sending them? Do they have a home to be sent to? Do they have access to, health care? Do they have access to transportation to be able to come back to the doctor's office? Do they have access to transportation to get food? All of those things we have to think about when we're talking about health. So the difference between the patients that I took care of in Michigan and the patients that I took care of here in Chicago made me think about what could we do here in the city of Chicago to deal with a lot of those inequities, to deal with a lot of the social determinants of health. So Food Matters was kind of born out of all of those experiences and under one roof. So there's a multitude of farms throughout the city of Chicago, community gardens. People are doing amazing, amazing things. The hatchery, a place where people can come and start a business. So the food system in the city of Chicago and really around the country is pretty broken. We learned during the pandemic that the local food system really needs to be built up. So in looking to address all of those things under one roof, Food Matters idea was born. Intentionally to address not only food access, but also nutrition education, which is something that a lot of people are kind of missing in the food equation, as we've learned from putting a Whole Foods in Inglewood. That was kind of a failed experiment. And so it's not just about bringing a grocery store to an area. You have to also look at the wages. You have to look at, are we providing nutrition education? Do the people know what to do with that really healthy food that you're now giving them? Farmers markets are wonderful, but we need that kind of quality and access every day, not just once a week during the summer for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. So looking at all those things, Food Matters addresses all of those issues kind of under one roof. Commercial shared kitchens, nutrition education facilities, community event space. We need to bring people together around the table to provide nutrition education, quality food, also making sure that our farmers and people that are working in the food system are paid living wages. So a consignment business model for the market, which brings all the local food system and helps the farms to grow. So there's all intentionally built with a multitude of revenue streams, which is a little scary for a lot of funders. It's not like your development box, here's an apartment and you have this many buildings. So intentionally, though, designed to address a lot of issues under one roof. So we are looking at all the social determinants of health, and there's also a residential component to it. One of the things that's important for our health is climate change, and so that was instrumental in part of the design of Food Matters in looking at geothermal and solar systems and an energy efficient near net zero greenhouse on site, and then just really climate friendly buildings. So and a lot of green space. So taking all those things into consideration, and the fact that we have 3 bus stops within a block and a half, and we are a block and a half from the 43rd Street Green Line station. So the transit is very important in relation to food access. So that's a big piece of giving people the opportunity to have access to affordable, healthy, quality, locally grown food 365 days a year.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So Nina, the city of Chicago, we heard a little bit about it on the previous panel, putting unprecedented dollars into ETOD. This is a dream come true for many folks in the room who've been working on this issue for a long, long time. Give us a quick explanation of the ETOD recovery program to ground us in sort of what it is. But I think more importantly, this, in my opinion, is one of your legacies as a public servant. What a wonderful thing to be proud of. So I'd like you to share with our audience your vision. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the money? I'd like you to share with our audience your vision of how this city could be different in 20 years because of the work that you're doing now.
Well, I think for me, especially at this part of my career in which I actually have momentum, an atmosphere of opportunity, as we like to say, shout out to Muse, and the actual money. I'm everybody's best friend all of a sudden because I oversee a $250 million program. But these are principles and things that I've been working towards my entire career, especially my colleagues at the Department of Housing and DPD. We've been working towards this for years, but now we actually have the momentum and the resources that we need to really accelerate a lot of the things that community members have been talking about for decades. I did not invent this. This is nothing new, right? I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of people that have done the work before me. And so I take that work very seriously and very personally in order to make sure that I do it right and I show up present and ready to do the work. So for me, the Chicago Recovery Plan, I know that, $10 million is earmarked for ETOD, but I actually see ETOD elements across all 11 of the programs under my umbrella. In fact, for a lot of our grants, we actually add points if you are within a certain area, if you qualify for ETOD in the Connected Communities Ordinance, right? So it's not just ETOD isolated. It's like, if you get a community development grant, and you're by transit, you have a better chance of actually getting those dollars. For example, our POP courts, which is reinstituting vacant lots into active parks. The Mahalia Jackson Court is a ETOD site, but it actually got funding under our POP initiative, right? And that's what I mean about actually embedding equity into a process. It's not that, there's this category of funds that I'm only going to use for this very specific niche thing. It's actually implementing that programmatic ideology across all of the money that we're spending and putting out of the door of DPD as best as we possibly can. And those are types of decisions and changes that I'm trying to see and embed. Two of our other values, I've mentioned that we have 5, is innovation and lasting. The Chicago Recovery Plan is something that's only going to last. The federal funding, so it's the American Rescue Plan funding, which ends at the end of 2024, and then Chicago decided to create social impact bonds, which will go on beyond that, but it generally only lasts for like 4 years, right? So we're in year 1 of a 4-year program. Every single program that I'm trying to do, I'm collecting data, I'm collecting program manuals, I'm collecting the methodology so that once this funding ends, I can go back to council and say, look at all the amazing things that are happening. Look at all the dots on this map and see how it's actually transforming these communities and why you should put your corporate dollars behind these programs, and that it shouldn't be an emergency. It shouldn't have to be a pandemic that comes in order for us to invest in our communities. So to me, I'm just showing proof of concept of things that people have already been saying in Chicago for decades. I'm not from Chicago, but I am from Detroit. I'm from the east side of Detroit. I took public transit every single day. Detroit does not have great public transit. I lived in Los Angeles for 7 years. I took public transit every single day. Los Angeles does not have great public transit. But that core principle and value has stayed in me, and I actually walk the talk in every job that I have, and I hope to leave a legacy when I leave Chicago, because the city of Chicago is aging me. But I do it because I know, again, Chicagoans deserve it. You deserve transparency. You deserve fairness. You deserve to get your just due without there being a veil, a mystery behind where your tax dollars are going.
Yeah. You're not going to leave Chicago.
Okay.
And I love that you pointed out that, supporting projects near transit, it's about more than the fund. Those dollars are earmarked for that, but you can bake it into a lot of other things. I mean, one of the reasons why the pre-development fund made a grant to Food Matters, one of the big reasons we made a grant to Food Matters was because it was near a transit station in Bronzeville. I mean, that, we probably score proposals differently, but when we saw that this was a brick and mortar project near a transit station, it goes right to the top, because it just, for 100 reasons, that makes so much sense. So, Sandra, we've talked a little bit about grant funding. And this is the innovation segment of our conversation. Let's talk about CDFI capital. And thank God for CDFIs. We wouldn't be able to do our work without CDFIs. We partner with Chicago is a CDFI city. We are so fortunate here to have CDFIs to work with because, as you know, they were created because commercial lenders weren't doing their jobs in cities in the 70s and 80s when there's so much flight to the suburbs. So maybe what are you thinking? And you can put just you said you're going to be yourself, so you're not representing the organization. What do you think CDFIs could do differently? Because CDFI dollars, they're not often the cheapest dollars in town. Thankfully, they are lending to these projects, but the dollars aren't always inexpensive. It can be expensive debt. And the process to secure the dollars can be arduous, and you even said opportunistic. What would you like to see CDFIs do when it comes to lending for brick and mortar, particularly around a transit station in a city like Chicago?
A lot more than is going on now, for sure. One of the things that I do see now that you both have talked about a little bit is momentum and the moment that we're in, because it matters. I mean, it's unfortunate in a lot of ways that you have to wait for your moment, but I think it matters a lot. And so I do think that we're in a moment where we have an interest and the ear, not just of CDFIs, which is incredibly important, but for CDFIs to have conversations with those that fund them, which are the banks and the federal government and foundations, in showing proof of concept of what can be done when funds are available, when we first talk to the communities and ask them what it is they need in developing funding opportunities, rather than developing the funding opportunities and saying, this is what we've got, we hope you can use it, and then blaming them for the failure when it's not able to be used. And so I see within LIIF and also within other CDFIs that there is internal interest in trying to make sure that equity is part of the conversation in the funding that they give, which requires them to look at things very differently, to look at, as SPARCC does, have conversations with communities to include thoughts about not just housing, but all of the other needs that communities have in terms of community centers. The hatchery is an amazing gem for the community and the city of Chicago. And so I would say that there are a couple things that are important. One is the conversations with community. Two is the willingness to bring that data back to the funders of. Sorry about that. To bring, as I said, the conversation back to the funders of CDFIs, the foundations, federal government, as well as the financial institutions, the banks, and then to, I think, look internally within the CDFI itself and find ways to make sure that the equity is an issue not just for the funding that they do, but it also needs to be part of what they do as an institution. Because what I found is that the whole company needs to be part of it. You can't just have the lenders say, we're going to lend. You have to have, I think, a company view that is shared and taught within the organization in order to make it happen.
Thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about the role of government. And Nina, I think I'm going to direct this question to you for obvious reasons. Government and ETOD, specifically the role of government, and this is let's geek out on planning for a second. So the role of government in connecting transportation and land use. Do people generally know what that means when I say making a connection between transportation and land use? It's like architects and planners. Like for decades, architects didn't have a relationship with planners. It's like, yeah, the building does have a relationship with the street out front. You should probably talk to one another. Same thing with transportation and land use. So for decades, enabled by zoning, by other bad policy decisions that led to segregation, et cetera, transportation and land use have operated, I'm speaking very generally here, but mostly independently. You know, this is one of the reasons why we have vacant lots and strip malls and parking lots next to transit stations. It's also the reason transportation systems have been used historically to separate and segregate us rather than to connect us. So if transportation were required to integrate land use, we might have a much more equitable built environment. So Nina, if you could, give us some insight into the sausage making in your institution, that's the City of Chicago, the Department of Planning and Development, that is helping to bring these two disciplines together. How are you helping your colleagues connect transportation and land use? And maybe you can use the Connected Communities Ordinance kind of as an example.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to tell you about two other positions that I hold. I mean, I love my job, but I am the president of the American Planning Association Illinois chapter. The American Planning Association is the largest association for planners across the nation. I am also a certified planner, so that means that I have to take certificate maintenance. You know, there's certain standards and ethical requirements, blah, blah, blah. And I am a part of the American Planning Association because we have so much leverage on what is taught in planning school and what are the standards for planners across the nation. We actually just recently released the draft of an equity and zoning policy guide for planners across the nation. And I think that is one way, right, to influence, regardless of where you work, whether you work in the private sector or in the public sector, kind of standards of how to embed equity into the zoning code across the country. I think we can look to examples like the Connected Communities Ordinance to say, like, yeah, there are cities that are doing it right. And like I said, in Los Angeles, our public transit agency paid us to upzone around transit, right? Because we knew that we needed, in order to get that ridership, in order to make sure affordability was still prevalent, in order to make sure that the people who needed to live by transit actually got access to it, we needed to do something. And in Los Angeles, density is a very bad word.
Yeah. And tell our audience what you mean by upzone.
Upzone as in, you know, if there's only allowed single family homes or a certain density of home, we would say, oh, we're going to, you know, maximize the amount of density that can happen around a transit station in order to enable more housing units. And so that therefore the ridership would be higher. The second position I hold, I sit on the board for CMAP, which is the local MPO here in Chicagoland. And I am always, almost at every meeting, saying, I know that we talk about transit a lot, but can we talk about land use at this board meeting? Because again, regionally, we have to, I know people are like, you know, Chicago, we're not Chicago. That's a lot of what my fellow board members like to say. But then I push back and say, I understand that you're not Chicago, but your metro stations and their parking lots are still half empty. So would you rather go past a half-empty metro lot because people aren't using it, or would you rather think about other ways in which you can utilize that space and attract more people to your area, your village, your small town? And people really, because zoning and land use is so mysterious and it's done like that on purpose, I'm so glad as a Black woman I actually know land use and zoning like the back of my hand. Because I get into those rooms and people think that they can talk over me, but I've again, written ordinances that have affected millions of people. I worked on the Los Angeles bid for the Olympics, upzoning and changing the zoning around LAX. So you really can't go toe-to-toe to me. try to get around it. So I say that to say the more you're able to educate yourself about zoning, but then it's also on the profession to make it less mysterious, to make it more accessible, to explain to people how they can utilize zoning to change their community and what that actually looks like. By the time you get a hearing notice, usually those decisions are usually made.
Yeah.
And so how do you insert yourself in the process or make sure that you're holding your local officials accountable to make sure that you're involved in the process early on? Because again, you need to know how to work within the system while you're also burning it down. And I am that person. I like to work within a system
and burn
while I also am working on how to revitalize and rethink the system. And I think that that's like a superpower that a lot more people need to lean into because, we're working with the circumstances that we have, but there's also the sky's the limit type of thing. And it is so important to, again, think about not transit isolated, but how is the land use pattern around these transit stations, or how are freeways. I'm from Detroit, freeway right through the middle of the city. The Black Bottom was completely gutted, right, for the highway. And now they're redoing that, but now in taking all of that away, it's like, okay, well, who is this for now? You've taken it away from the Black folks that live here, and are you just going to gentrify it? And we need to start having these conversations and talking about the real mechanisms as to how these things get built, how they get enabled, how you can take them away. And I think and once we as a profession start to do that more proactive engagement and education, we can really talk the walk of actually helping community members, empower them of how to actually strategically and legally change their community one lot at a time.
Legally. All right, thank you for that. We only have time for a couple more questions before we go to audience Q&A. So kind of in keeping with this theme of government, but this is a question to all three. We can get one answer. That we don't need responses from everybody. But I'd like to set the question up just to state the obvious. Racial equity, doesn't always factor into government decision making when it comes to the built environment. This we know, particularly when it comes to transportation, because Laurie, like real estate development, transportation is largely white, male-dominated field where decisions are based on kind of moving people safely and efficiently. And transportation decisions also tend to be fairly formulaic, which means the dollars tend to get spread around so that everybody's happy rather than going to the places that actually could use those dollars most. And then I think on top of that, so that's decades and decades and decades of habit and decision making, now we've got this kind of existential crisis. And then there's urban disinvestment. And then add on top of that this existential crisis of online retail, delivery services, is anyone ever going to go to a restaurant again? I mean, you can just get everything delivered to your door, remote work. These are things that can kill an urban corridor. And we need, as urban people, cities around the world are grappling with this, an entire rethink of our commercial districts and how we engage with our commercial districts. So maybe a question that one of you could answer so we can go to the next question before we do audience Q&A. My question is, how transit stations, how can they be catalysts for a different kind of development in a post-Amazon world, especially in a community that hasn't seen much development in 50 years? So how can a transit station catalyze a new kind of thinking about how we engage with our commercial corridors, our urban main streets? Anything come to mind? I'm asking anyone who has a response.
I think in looking at the train station itself, are we thinking about that in the same way it's just a place from point A to point B? Or like the Garfield Boulevard train station, where there's an art installation and there are places, a destination right there at the train station. Looking at 43 Green and Phil's development, where it's an apartment building. I mean, literally the apartment building is on this side of the train station, and then the second phase is on this side of the train station with commercial all around the ground floor. So I think in looking at, is the train station, could it be more than just a train station?
Yeah.
Truly, ETOD in that you're
Right.
going there to get whatever is right there at the train station.
I'm thinking of Melvin Thompson. Melvin, are you here still? Hey, Melvin. I'm thinking of the 95th Street station down in Washington Heights. It was designed to be very, very different, and it looks very, very different, and it was designed for programming and music and community and celebration, and it is those things. But Melvin, now we need to develop around it. This is where the land use piece comes in, right? So, all right. How about I do another question, because questions from the audience are coming in. One more question, and this is the developer capital provider question. Laurie, you're a person trying to get your project financed. This is not an easy lift for 100 different reasons. Can maybe talk us through the one thing that you are most frustrated by? And like, if you were a bank or a loan officer or a foundation representative, how might you evaluate your project?
Oh, that's a big question. I would have to say, because this project is unique, it is a kind of a hard sell to funders. Like, I could go build an apartment building maybe tomorrow, and if I could get a little bit of capital or had a vacant lot. But because this project is so different and it has so many moving parts, and because I'm a woman, and because I'm a nurse, and because I'm not a developer with deep pockets, all of those things are, kind of against me. So I've had to, I'm pretty stubborn. I've been working on this project since 2017. I convinced Alderman Dowell that this was a great thing, and she had me go to a town hall meeting, and I was the last presenter at a town hall meeting that was filled with developers with fancy slideshows, and I got up there with my poster board and, just told the story. And it was the community that really, were there to support the project. So this has kind of been from the ground up, but the frustrating piece of it is that because I'm not that, what people see as a developer, that's been very difficult to go in to Chicago Community Loan Fund, who I know very well now, and pitch the project and say, yes, I know this is not an apartment building. Yes, I do realize it has 10 revenue streams, and that's kind of unusual. But this is what it's for, and this is why it works, and all of those things. So,
thank you for that, Sandra. I mean, as a capital provider, does this sound unusual to you? And
unfortunately, no. But one of the things that I was speaking about earlier is that, especially for CDFIs, what's important is not just the capital, it's the technical assistance for developers like you who don't have development as a background, but you have an idea, you have a vision, but you need assistance to make it happen. And so what I see frequently is opportunities that, but for the idea of finding technical assistance, people who know how to talk the language that you need to know, and having an entity that's willing to pay for them to assist you. And so that's a part of what I was talking about in terms of CDFIs that they need to provide as well, in listening to the community, understanding what they need, and part of what they need is technical assistance, and that needs to be provided as well.
I'll add something.
Please.
So I'm not a CDFI. But I do have $237 million at my disposal. And so, and in this job, I mean, in planning, I've never had to do as much grant making as I'm doing right now. And what you said really stuck with me, because we're giving out grants to community members and great projects that really need it, but the technical assistance is really, really important. So you may have seen that we announced last week that we put out an RFP for technical assistance for our ETOD grantees. So that means if you get an ETOD grant, you will automatically get built-in technical assistance in order to help you get from announcements, which are cool and nice and shiny, to an actual ribbon cutting, which is what we really want. We want people to be successful. And what I think people don't realize is that it takes so much intentional hand-holding on the part of stakeholders, government stakeholders, financial stakeholders, in order to really make sure that these entrepreneurs are going to be successful. You can't just hand them a check and say, okay, good luck, there you go. It's like, no, you need to invest, because again, especially when they don't have access to capital, they come to us, right? They come to us, and that takes a little bit more hand-holding, because they really have never had to, do reporting or, have a staff finance person, or, not, send you screenshots of receipts, but actually submit them in iSupplier. Like, those are things that we really need to work on. And so we, as a department and my team, have decided we are actually going to invest in making sure that they get the technical assistance they need, and not just hand them checks for development.
So before we go to Q&A, let's do a rapid fire, just quick responses to close out the conversation. What is, and we'll start with you, Nina, what's the most meaningful action that people in your field or your network can do to keep the ETOD momentum going?
I guess moving past performative measures and getting into the revolution. I think we all have talked, and we come to symposiums and we sit on panels, but what are you doing in your everyday life to undo the harm that has been done? Pick one thing a week. It could be little, it could be big, it could be attending that meeting that you get in, like Commissioner Navarro said. And even if you're like, oh, this project's great, still show up, see what people are talking about. Submitting a letter of support for that affordable housing project. Holding your alderman accountable for, going against a project that you believe in. Like, those are the types of things that I think people need to do, and not just talk about it, but be about it.
What about you, Laurie? The most meaningful action that someone in your field or your network could do to keep the momentum around developing near transit going?
I would say be thoughtful. Pay attention to what's going on around you, and just really be mindful about how the inequities that we see every day, where you get busy with your life and you're going back and forth to work, but you might not actually stop and think about people that are having issues with access to food. Think about those things, be mindful, and maybe do some research on what is actually causing that here in the city of Chicago, and just educate yourself.
How about you, Sandra? Last word.
I think I'll probably choose a couple of words that they've used. I think being an advocate is incredibly important, but the advocacy that I'm thinking about is kind of the level up from CDFIs to, quite frankly, those entities that have the funding, the foundations, the government entities, and the big banks, to see the opportunity and the reasons that this kind of development is possible, to see past, in the cases of the banks, the primary purpose of everything, which is how much money am I going to make from it. So I think that we need to broaden the table, that many more entities that are going to allow the funding of these opportunities to make a reality, make the transit-oriented development equitable and a reality for the people that really need it.
Thank you for that. So we're at the Q&A portion. How am I on time? 10 minutes left for Q&A, Kim? Okay, good. We have the first question is for you, Nina, and it's coming in through Zoom. Can you share the 5 equity values you use in decision making?
Yes, I will try to remember them. Equitable, innovative, data-informed, lasting, and the last one is, I might forget it. It's escaping me.
But it's really important.
It's really important. What is it? Lasting, equitable. Come back to me.
Okay.
I'm gonna get that 5th one.
Other questions? Yes, Stephen.
Hi, my name is Stephen Vans. So assuming you agree with the the foundation of my question. The question is, how can we get CTA more involved? And so the foundation is, I'll give an example. So first of all, Nina, you said you run a $237 million development and funding agency, essentially, at the moment. And Laurie, you said that CTA stations need to have more commercial space and more gathering and more attraction. So the CTA rebuilt the Pink Line station in 2004, and it built in a lot of commercial spaces, most of which are unused at the moment. And then it hired JLL, one of the world's largest real estate marketing and brokerage firms, to find tenants. And so far it has failed to do so. So how do we bring CTA to become a better developer in addition to what it's already doing, which is just building and operating transit, but how do we bring them to be community developers as well?
Yeah, so this is really the transportation land use connection. Is anyone from CTA here? We've got one
Okay, there's a
person.
lone person and two people.
Couple people.
Well, unless you want to volunteer to answer, I will say from the DPD perspective, I think our Commissioner Maurice Cox has done a really good job of being intentional and being at the table with CTA. Our Far South team, Jasmine Gunn specifically, has worked numerous hours, countless days with CTA to reimagine and be more thoughtful about the planning around the stations. Our team has worked tirelessly, and honestly, these are two different agencies with two different boards, with two, so there's only so much, any one person or any one of my colleagues can do. But I think we have definitely tried to put our good foot forward and be thoughtful in partnership with CTA as best as we possibly can. And then, of course, again, just like you can write letters into Maurice Cox and say, we love or hate this, you can do the same to their president and CEO. So, we can do our best, and you all do your best from the outside.
Back in the day, CTA actually had a TOD position. I think it might have been occupied by Maria Choka-Urban, for those of you who know Maria, who's terrific, but this is like 12 or more years ago. Rosa, you have a question.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see so many kind, beautiful faces in the room.
And that's a founding member of Elevated Chicago, by the way, Rosa Ortiz.
Thank you. I didn't expect the applause, but thank you. Humbly, I am on the board of the CTA, and I am more than happy to help connect. Just as you mentioned, I'm only one person. There's a lot of boards. There's a lot of decisions makers in the entire process. But to the extent that I can help bridge that connection, I'm more than happy to coordinate, support. I know CTA is working a lot with DPD, with DOH. So know that those connections are happening, but I continue to be very supportive of this work. I wholeheartedly connect with the kind of effort that is being done here. So to the extent that I can help continue to bring those bridges to connect, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you, Rosa. Additional questions?
The last value is people-centered. It was killing me.
Good one.
It was killing me. It's people-centered.
And it's a good one.
It is.
Okay, what else? Surely there are additional questions. Leslie?
So I know I'm asking this for everyone in Zoom land and everyone here, but mainly I'm asking for myself. This question is for Nina. Where do I put in the application for the Nina Fan Club? I would like to apply for the presidency. Please and thank you.
There's an email address called Nina's Fan Club at Gmail.
Yeah, see, this is what I knew. I knew Badassery also gathered us together.
You're very sweet. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Leslie. And we have another question back here. No.
I was asking on behalf of...
Okay. All right, what else? Okay, well, without further ado, let's thank our panelists. I want to thank Sandra in particular. It is not easy to step in when two of your panel members get sick at the 11th hour, and this woman stepped in and she did a beautiful job. But thank all three of them.
It's called SPARCC. That's what we do.